Hello everyone, and welcome back to St. John's Presents, the Protestant Reformation. Tonight we're starting the Catholic response to the Reformation, so kind of the Catholic Reformation. My name is Danielle Kuhn. I'm the Director of Faith Formation at St. John the Baptist. Disclaimer, I am not an expert. I don't have a PhD in church history. I wish I had a PhD in church history. Someone get me connected. I'd love to get a PhD in church history. I just love talking about this topic and get the opportunity to talk live on YouTube about it. I think that's all I have for bureaucratic introductory announcements. Besides that, religious education registration and registration for RCIA, aka a class on the theology and philosophy of the Catholic faith, is ongoing. And if you would like to sign up for either of those things as a way to increase either the faith knowledge of your kids or your own knowledge of your faith, you can do so at stjohnthebaptist.org or send me an email at daniellec@johnthebaptist.org and I will help you get signed up for whichever of those two you would like to do. Especially RCIA. Do RCIA. I'd love to see everybody at RCIA. All right, let's get into it. So, in discussing the Catholic reform that occurred in response to the Protestant Reformation, it's important to acknowledge that lots of challenges existed. It wasn't an easy movement to get started. Like I have said throughout this series, the Reformation did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in response partly to some very real problems that existed in the Catholic Church at this time, not the least of which was clerical abuse and corruption within the Church. So, if those are two of your big problems, corruption and abuse of power within the Church, you can imagine why it was really hard to get the Church rolling in terms of reforming that corruption and abuse. It's really hard to get rid of corruption of power when the people who you need to come together to talk about and reform that problem of corruption of power are the people who are themselves corrupt. You see? Not to say all the bishops were corrupt, definitely not by any means, but there was a substantial enough amount of bishops and cardinals and priests who were abusing their positions that they really made it difficult for the Catholic reform movement to get going, which hurt the Catholic Church a lot in terms of its ability to respond to Luther and the other reformers quickly. So, a few examples to illustrate how this corruption made it difficult for the reform of the Catholic Church to get going. St. Charles Borromeo, spoiler alert, became a saint. His life is an example of these challenges. He was the Archbishop of Milan in Italy, and an example of a really saintly guy who was fighting against the corruption that he saw in the church among some of his fellow priests and bishops. However, his reforming efforts in Milan against corruption were met with tons of resistance, really by the clergy at every turn. He had many just people who stood in his way. He even had one of his own priests, so he's a bishop, he had one of his own priests try to assassinate him, and he lived. Another example we have is Bishop, I'm not going to be able to say this right, Francesc Sala of Catalonia in Spain. I don't have a picture of him because when I tried to find a picture of him, all I could find was a picture of some military general from the 1800s. So just imagine this guy. He's a bishop, Bishop Sala of Catalonia in Spain. He had so many people trying to assassinate him all the time for his efforts to reform the church in Spain that he had to go around everywhere with armed guards. It was a dangerous thing to be a bishop during this time in the Catholic Church and be fighting actively to get rid of corruption and to help reform the church. Lastly, the last example I want to give is St. John of the Cross. So St. John of the Cross, very well-known mystic writer, wrote a lot about the interior life, dark night of the soul. That's this guy. He was inspired by St. Teresa of Avila, and after getting backing by the Pope, he sought to reform the Carmelite order of monks. So this is important because it's not just necessarily priests or bishops who have certain priests and bishops who are corrupt. Corruption also found its way into monasteries, into monastic orders, both convents and monasteries and abbeys. So St. John of the Cross wants to reform his Carmelite order, Carmelite monks, and he was imprisoned for his efforts by his own religious order. He was put in prison because his superiors were so against what he was trying to accomplish reform-wise within the order. And he would have died from the torture that he was being put through by his own corrupt superiors. But he ended up escaping from jail in the dead of night one night. And for the remainder of his life, though, St. John of the Cross had to be on the run. He was a fugitive. All this to say, it was not easy to be a holy person seeking truth and purification of the church and authentic goodness of its leaders during this time period. Because of this, we have a lot of saints from this time period. It truly was a heroic thing to take on the task of reforming the Catholic Church. And not reforming in the way that Luther did or the other Protestant reformers who just broke away, but saying, all right, the Catholic Church is sick. It has some problems here. I'm not going to abandon her. I'm going to devote myself, even at the cost of my own life, well-being, freedom, to improving and purifying the church once again. So some really heroic men and women during this time period. But the point of these three examples is just to show that the Catholic Reformation faced much, if not greater, difficulty than the Protestant Reformation in terms of getting the ball rolling and facing adversity because of the nature of the problems the church was facing. It's difficult, again, I say this, it is difficult to solve the problem of corrupt leaders when your leaders are the ones who have to solve the problem. It's tough. So, we have five phases of Catholic reform. We have from 1378 to 1517, which is an interesting phase because it's mostly just the phase of the Catholic Church has problems. There's internal issues and heresies are trying to be locally contained. There were some reform efforts that went on during this time period. In the early 1500s, there were the Lateran councils, but they're kind of weak sauce. They didn't have any fighting power. There's phase 2, which is between 1517 and 1545, which goes from the rise of Luther to the opening of the Council of Trent, when Catholic responses to the Protestant Reformation were kind of scattered and all over the place and not very effective. And then there's phase 3, which is during the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, when the Catholic reformers finally get coordinated and the leaders of the church devise a coherent plan for reform of the church, genuine reform. And not just reform, but response to the Protestant Reformation as well. Then there's phase 4, between 1563 and 1618, when the reforms of Trent began to actually be implemented. There were a lot of reforms from the Council of Trent that were officially written down, officially proclaimed, but not actually put into action. So during this time period, phase 4, everything starts actually being enacted and lived out. Very turbulent period because of this. And then there's from 1618 to around 1700, when the rise of skepticism with the Enlightenment happens, and with empirical science. And all of religion, really, all of Christianity has to contend with this new problem. It's kind of like, at phase 5, the Catholic Church has finally responded adequately and put into action all of its reforms, and then they finally address this Protestant Reformation thing, and then they have empiricism and the Enlightenment that comes about. Not to say the Enlightenment was a bad thing, it just presented new challenges to the Church that it had to address. Things like empiricism, which is another topic that I would love to go into sometime. Okay, so Catholic reactions to Protestantism. Let's talk about that phase 2 period between 1517 and 1545, when the Council of Trent was called, when Catholics were trying to respond, but were doing so in a kind of haphazard, ineffective way. What a break. I really hope you can't hear me swallowing on this mic. I'm unfortunately pretty sure you can, and I'm sorry for that. I can't do anything about it, so I apologize. All right, Catholic reactions. So, Protestant reforms have proliferated at this time. They're kind of everywhere. And there was one of the issues to the Catholic response during this time period is that it was sort of high-minded. It's not a bad thing to be high-minded. It's just like, know your audience, you know? So eminent bishops, theologians, intellectuals, and monks wrote these detailed theological treatises in Latin that refuted Luther's theology. But these treatises didn't really do much to diminish Luther's popularity, because Luther, I mean, he can write in Latin, but he also writes in a colloquial dialect that everyone can understand. And Luther's writing, I mean, he's no idiot by any means. Luther's writing is good, but it's maybe a little less high-minded, a little more filled with scatological jokes and flatulence. Long treatises written by theologians responding to Luther. They're not widely read, so they do very little to change any popular public opinion. Catholic apologists were really trying to undercut Protestantism at the intellectual level. Unfortunately, for much of the laity, the intellectual level is not the one that they most needed to be engaged in. For most of the laity who were captured and enthralled by Luther, they weren't like, oh yes, Luther, I've been thinking about this whole justified by faith and works and free will. I've been thinking about that a ton in my spare time too. I'm so glad you've presented me with an answer. No, most of the laity weren't thinking about that. But when Luther starts talking about indulgences and abuse of power and corruption in the church, that they can get behind because they've experienced it. They've recognized it. They've seen it at a local level, and they're sick and tired of it. So that more practical, lived out, experienced side of the Reformation is really the one that Catholics needed to engage the people in. Not necessarily the really abstract, intense, very philosophical, theological debates that were happening between Catholics and Protestant reformers. So the people were angry at the signs of corruption they saw in individual bishops. They're frustrated at the abuse of indulgences and easily caught up in ideas like, oh yes, priests should be allowed to get married, the Bible should be printed for everyone, and denounce clerical authority. It's really easy to get people behind denouncing authority. Conversely, it can also be really easy to rile people up to support maybe a negative authority. That's another topic. We're not going to get into it. So, in addition, very few Catholic supporters employed humor or satire against Protestantism. There are, and I showed early on, some examples of satirical cartoons that attacked Protestants, but there were a lot more Protestant cartoons that attacked Catholicism. And these are very easy for the laity to connect with and engage in. They are pictures. Protestants really capitalized on cartoons in newspapers that mocked Catholic officials and ideas. St. Francis de Sales, who come back, Francis. I really love him. He's a wonderful writer. Got some great quippy quotes. Okay, not quippy, beautiful. That's not the right word. Beautiful quotes. He was the Bishop of Geneva during this time period, and he was one Catholic who did a decent job at reaching the laity. He published a lot of small leaflets that were widely distributed against Protestant ideas. So they were small, they weren't too dense, they kept it simple, and they argued against and denounced Protestant ideas one at a time in a kind of easy to grasp manner. Sermons, both Protestant and Catholic, began to be published in newspapers, which led to an interesting change in Catholic sermons. Before, they had been very academic sounding, and they became a lot more colloquial and understandable for the common person, which is a good thing, I think. There's a place for very academic, structured sermons, but there's also a lot of room for more easy to reach, easy to grasp sermons for the people. Ooh, sorry, I got a tickle in my throat. Okay, so they also focused a lot more on biblical exegesis. That means that they would take a Bible story and explain it, give the interpretation of it to the people, give them a lens through which to view the Bible, which was really helpful now that the Bible was published in many common languages and anyone could read it. It was helpful to actually start talking about how to interpret the Bible, how we read things, how theologians read things. And they were less formal. So debates were also widely favored as a way to correct one side. However, the debates were often fixed. So whether it was a Catholic-sponsored debate that was being set up or a Protestant-sponsored debate that was being set up, depending on who was sponsoring it, oftentimes the debate was sort of fixed so that the Catholic always won or the Protestant always won. So they weren't really helpful in really creating understanding between the people because everybody already favored one side or the other. So that's that phase. Phase 2 of the Reformation. In phase 3, we begin the Council of Trent. Council of Trent had very humble beginnings. There was a lot of uncertainty about it. I mean, 1517, Luther's theses are posted. Finally, we get a council going to address all these things in 1545. Like, a lot has happened. The whole thing with Munster, Zwingli, Calvin, a ton has happened, and we're finally getting a council going. And there were only 30 bishops that first attended. I read somewhere on the internet a couple days ago, and it was from a Protestant-sponsored site, so that probably plays a role. But they wrote down that there were only 30 bishops at the Council of Trent the entire time. That's definitely not true. More people did show up, but in the beginning, only 30. Only 30 people came. It was convoked in December 1545 by Pope Paul III, in the city of Trent, which was a city in the Italian Alps. It met in 25 sessions over 18 years. Can you imagine if that happened now? I feel like we hear about a Vatican Synod going on for a year, and we're like, dang, how are they not done already? 18 years of continuing the same council. They were really taking their time and trying to be thorough. And they did have long gaps in between sessions that could even be like multiple years worth long gaps, which sometimes made people really have despair that it would ever even conclude. It'd be tough to be Catholic during this time period. It'd be hard. That's why there's saints that came from it. Because when the going gets tough, the saints get going. However, the Council of Trent did succeed in reforming the church successfully in a number of ways, and it really set the course for Catholicism for the next 400 years. We today still greatly feel the effects of the Council of Trent. A few things were changed at Vatican II, and we'll get into that, but from the Council of Trent till Vatican II, it was hugely influential. So why did it take so long to call the Council of Trent to handle the Protestant Reformation? Well, first of all, there was the location. Everything was argued about in this. So it ended up being in Trent in the Italian Alps, which was a compromise between Rome and Germany, because there was a lot of bickering. One side wanted the council to be in Rome, the other side wanted the council to be in Germany. This one disagreement played a big role in pushing it off. There was also a lot of fighting between Francis I, who was the King of France at this time, and Charles V, who, if you remember Charles V, big chin, big Habsburg chin, he was the Holy Roman Emperor during this time period. They oddly don't like one another, even though Francis, he's the King of France, which is a huge Catholic ally. Charles V is the Holy Roman Empire, supposed to be a huge Catholic ally. There's a ton of rivalry between them and fighting. They just don't like one another. And this put the Pope in the church in a funky position because the Pope was connected to Francis I and Charles V. It seems like the Pope shouldn't have really been involved in their affairs, but Francis I's son and heir was engaged to Catherine Medici, and the Pope during this time was a Medici. So he does not want to mess that marriage up. Like, keep Francis on good terms with us, or the heir to the throne of France isn't going to be marrying your niece. And then for Charles was the grandson of Queen Isabella of Spain. Spain is a traditional huge ally for the church and protector, and like got the muscle to keep the church safe kind of thing. So Spain's a powerful Catholic ally. And Francis I and Charles V, for a variety of reasons that get crazy complicated, don't want this council to happen yet. Or they want the council to happen in a certain way at a certain time, and they want to have certain favors in the council. Just this relationship between different rulers who were having a rivalry made it difficult to get the ball rolling. And then in addition, the church is fighting internally against a lot of bishops and cardinals who are corrupt, as I said before, who don't want this council to happen at all. Because this council's purpose is all about getting rid of those corrupt bishops and cardinals. So they would like to stay corrupt and abusing their power. Thank you very much. No council for them. Before getting into the first session of the council, I want to say a bit on Pope Paul III, who is just an interesting guy. He was born Alessandro Farnese. And if you recognize the name Farnese, that's because it's one of those powerful Italian names like Borgia or Medici. They kind of had a powerful, not empire, but they held a lot of control over the Diocese of Parma. Alessandro was very educated when he was growing up. He was a humanist. Pope Paul III was not a saint. That's why we don't call him Saint Pope Paul III. In his youth, he certainly led a very dissolute life. He was made a cardinal, or he was made a bishop pretty early on. Not really, he didn't really deserve the title bishop at the time. And he partied, lots of not so great things in his life. He had a mistress and had 3 children by that mistress. But In 1513, he comes under the guidance of his, not parochial vicar, but what's it called? Vicar General, Bartolomeo Giudiccioni. And under his guidance, he does have a change of heart. He cuts everything off with his mistress, and he devotes himself to reform. In 1513, under the guidance of this Vicar General, he becomes passionate about reforming the church. And he starts with Parma. He starts with reforming his Diocese of Parma. But later on, when he's appointed a cardinal and becomes part of the Roman Curia, he still is devoted to reform. Which is fascinating because when he is eventually made Pope, he's displaying this same zeal for reform, but at the same time, he's associated with the nepotism he fights so much against, because he makes 2 of his teenage grandsons, teenagers, cardinals, which a lot of people were not happy with him for, understandably. So Pope Paul III, very imperfect, but at the same time, we see his commitment to reforming the church. And I want to use Pope Paul III as kind of an archetype for a lot of popes that you see during this time period. A lot of popes, from 850 AD to 1900 AD, there was a lot of popes that maybe weren't so awesome. But in the midst of their not so awesomeness, God was still able to work and do good things for his church through them. Was Pope Paul a saint? Like I said, no, he wasn't. He had a lot of things that he could have improved on. However, through him, God worked to reform his church. And you can see this in even the worst popes. Think Pope Alexander VI, who was Alexander Borgia, famous for having affairs while he was pope and favoring his children while he was pope, and living a life all about pleasure. He still did good things for the church. If you read about him, you do have to read a lot of negative things. But also, he supported church art. He is responsible for the beautiful ceiling in the Church of St. Maria Maggiore in Rome. He worked to protect the library. He really was smart and astute about the church treasury. He really worked to respond with justice towards crime in Rome at the time. So he did some good things. All that to say, Alexander Borgia, Pope Alexander the Sixth, still did some good things. God can work good for his church, even with popes who are imperfect, even wildly imperfect human beings. And I think we see that in Pope Paul. He's got some issues. We all do. But he also displayed a great commitment to reforming the church, and finally got the first session of the Council of Trent rolling. So, despite all your flaws, Pope Paul III, we thank you for getting that done. All right. Moving forward. Oh, wait, I have a list of accomplishments that Pope Paul did. Actually, I just really have a note here that says, if anyone knows a good biography of Pope Paul III, I would like to read it. So, if anyone knows of a good biography, I would like to read it. All right. So the Council of Trent had 3 agendas. Let's bring up the Council of Trent. 3 agendas. 1, solve the Protestant problem. 2, clarify several points on doctrine and ritual, especially those that Protestants have called into question. So let's get clear on church doctrine. And then 3, eliminate the corruption and abuses that were part of the instigation for the Protestant Reformation in the first place. So first place, Protestant problem, clarifying doctrinal things, addressing clergy abuse and corruption. Okay, first objection is doomed from the start. At this point, 1545, there is no, by solving the Protestant problem, what they mean is reconciling the Protestants with the Catholic Church again, bringing everyone united under one church once again. This goal was doomed from the start. It's been a while since Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. A lot has happened. There's a lot of water under the bridge. There is going to be no reconciliation at this point. So objective 1 was really doomed from the start. Objective 2 had a lot accomplished in the first, and that's clarifying doctrine, saw a lot accomplished in the very first session of the Council of Trent. So the council issues 2 decrees on Holy Scripture. 1, it affirms the authority of the Church to interpret Scripture and the role of tradition in the Christian life. So this means divine revelation includes magisterium, which is the teaching body of the Church, Holy Scripture, so the Bible, and then tradition. So the apostolic authority passed down through the ages, and wisdom passed down through the ages. And then 2, it also pronounced the Latin Vulgate Bible as error-free. This was important because if you remember when we talked about the humanists, they were very into wanting to go back to Hebrew and Greek. And that was great, except for there were some people who said, oh, no, we cannot read the Bible in any language but Hebrew and Greek because they are the most original and the closest, and anything else will result in heresy and an impure faith. The Council of Trent rules, no, the Latin Vulgate Bible is good, it's error-free, you do not have to read the Hebrew or the Greek version, the Latin one is fine, error-free, which is great. That helps a lot of people. The council formally rejects the belief of sola fide, so the idea of salvation by faith alone, or justification by faith alone only. And it rejected double predestination, so the idea that God destined some people for heaven and some people for hell. It affirmed the objective efficacy of the sacraments. So what does that mean? It means that when you receive a sacrament, no matter what, as long as you're in a state of grace, you receive objective grace from that sacrament. It doesn't matter how worthy you are as a person. It doesn't matter how much good stuff you've done. It doesn't matter how prayerful or in the moment you are. Objectively, you'll receive grace. The sacraments are objectively efficacious. They give objective, efficacious grace. That's what that means. Now, depending on the attitude of your soul and your disposition, how seriously you take the sacrament, how much you prepare for the sacrament, you can receive more grace, but a sacrament always confers some amount of grace, no matter the disposition of the individual. And that was important for the council to affirm because a lot of Protestant reformers as a whole were attacking the sacraments, saying they're not necessary, they don't do anything, the church has no authority, anyone can receive grace at any time by doing something else, which isn't untrue. You can receive grace at any time because God is God and grace comes from God, and thus he can do what he wants with his grace. But God chooses to always give an objective, efficacious grace through the sacraments. And the council affirms that. The institutional reforms, so the goal 3 reforms to get rid of abuse and corruption, from the first council were fairly modest. It was like, that was going to be the toughest one to accomplish. So we'll get there. And in the beginning, baby steps. But these ones working to eliminate corruption they just simply would take longer to get everyone on board with. Basically, they were just waiting for the corrupt individuals to kind of retire or die out so that they could get replaced with non-corrupt reforming cardinals who would be on board with everything. But in the first session, they did set a decree that gave new strict rules for the assignment of bishoprics. So like, who gets to be a bishop of what? And they insisted that the bishop has to actually live in their diocese. Sounds crazy that that had to be a rule that they insisted upon, but they said, no, if you're the Bishop of Denver, you should actually like be in Denver sometimes. You should, so you can be with your people. And they said that priests too had to actually reside at their parishes. So, you know, Father Umberto couldn't be the priest of St. John the Baptist, but live in Hawaii. He actually had to be at the parish of St. John the Baptist. The second phase, or the second session, lasted hardly even a year, and it really wasn't as effective at accomplishing things. It did less, but what it did do was powerful, because it did give an important decree on the Eucharist, and the Eucharist is incredibly important, so we're happy that the second session got that done. This decree on the Eucharist reaffirmed transubstantiation, reaffirmed the veneration of the Eucharist. So everything the Catholic Church had been teaching on the Eucharist, it doubled down, and it was like, yes, no, it's not a symbol. We weren't kidding. It is a sacrament, and it's a big deal. And that's what the decree said. Yeah, in those exact words. It's a big deal. That's what the decree said. So then the third and the last Council of Trent, it was delayed for 9 years. 9 years as the Protestant Reformation kept going and the Reformers kept going and things were getting crazy in England. But this was because of the election of a new pope. And if you have a new pope, he's got to get on board. The people who support him, he has to work with them. It's complicated. But eventually it finally does get underway, and it was arguably the most productive and significant. At this point, there is a new generation of cardinals and bishops, and many more. Remember, we started out with only 30. At this point, there's well over 200 bishops at this last session of the Council of Trent. We're going to get a new photo. If we have a new session, new photo. So there's a new generation of leaders who are passionate about reform, and they want to get this done. They've lived through the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant breaking off, and they're tired of not doing anything about it. They want to get things done. They want to address problems. They want to make things happen. Oh man, I'm yawning. Okay. So on the doctrinal front, it reaffirmed the sacramental nature of marriage and the Mass. So if you recall, many Protestant reformers completely did away with the Mass. It just kind of became a sermon thing because a Mass, you got rid of the sacramental nature of the Eucharist, therefore you get rid of the sacramental nature of the Mass. And then marriage also was taken away from having a status as a sacrament. It was seen as just kind of like a necessary public institution that helped people sin less. Whereas in the Catholic Church, we do see it as something raised to the level of a sacrament that gives efficacious grace to the bride and groom when they get married, helping them to lead holier lives. It also affirmed the existence of purgatory, the value of indulgences. It condemned the sale, because remember, the church has never been okay and never sold indulgences. It just kind of allowed for some shady miscommunication that made it seem like you needed to pay money for an indulgence, which is not okay. But it reaffirmed the value of indulgences, that they are worthwhile and important and legitimate. It also affirmed the veneration of saints, images, and relics. Remember, veneration is not the same as worship. You can venerate a thing or person that reflects God and as such is due honor, because it is pointing to God in a beautiful way. And what you're doing in that veneration is really recognizing God in that thing. But you never worship that thing because it is not God. The thing or the person is not God. So we don't worship anyone but God. Long story short, no worshiping anything but God. One very tough question for the council was whether bishops derive their authority from God or from the Pope. Authority from God or authority from the Pope. Eventually, they kind of come to this end result where they say both, but that the Pope did have a great measure of control over bishops as the vicar of Christ's church on earth. And I think that makes sense. That's to me, if you say, do you get your authority from the Pope or God? It's like God through the Pope. And in some sense, there's like different aspects of your own office as bishop that kind of have authority in different ways from the Pope and from God. So in the end, I agree. I agree with their result that they came up with. It's a mixture of both. On the reforming front for getting rid of corruption and abuse, they established very strict, even stricter rules for the appointment of bishops and cardinals. So this is going to help address the, making your teenage grandson the cardinal when he's 14, or making your nephew a bishop when he's 9. Those things are being cracked down upon, and people are like, no, we can't have this. We need to have legitimate bishops. We need to have legitimate cardinals. Definitely no one under the age of 30, which is a thing. If you think back to Bishop Albert of Mainz, the one who was corrupt and by the age of 23 had collected 3 different bishoprics for himself, and then proceeded to pay off his own debts by promoting the sale of indulgences or the miscommunication of indulgences. It helps address those types of problems. It also required bishops to annually review the priests of their diocese. So many of these things seem like, were you guys not doing that before? Yes, bishop, if you're the bishop of your diocese, you should review and look over your priests. But that wasn't there. And wisely, they said that needs to be there. So bishops had to review their diocese, all their priests, once a year. On a required, regularly scheduled, diocesan synods and councils to check up on the status of things also needed to happen. So I see this even at the micro level when Father Umberto and Father Daniel, I think once a month, have their deanery meeting where they meet with all the other priests of their deanery. I'm not 100% sure on what a deanery is, but I am assuming it's a group of priests in your area, and you meet to discuss problems, issues, how are things going. The Council of Trent set up that format, not only on the small priest level, but for bishops and for cardinals. We all need to be meeting every once in a while so we can touch base, so we can talk about what new issues are we facing. What do we have a problem with? What do we need to address? Also a really good idea. They set up strict penalties for clergy who broke the vow of celibacy, fathered illegitimate children, or lived with common law spouses. So this is a big one because it was so common. It was like, oh yeah, my priest has a mistress. Oh yeah, my priest lives with a common law wife. Oh yeah, my bishop has 4 children and 8 grandchildren. That had become such a, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about it? At the Council of Trent, they were like, well, we're going to do something about it. And there's going to be really strict penalties if priests do this, because we can't have this anymore. We can't have popes and bishops favoring their children and their grandchildren by giving them positions as cardinals or special setups at different parishes. That looks really bad. That reflects very badly on the church. So they crack down on all of those things. And then, for the fathers of illegitimate children. They also required bishops to establish schools for the training of priests in their diocese. And this one is crazy to me. As crazy as it sounds, priest seminaries and education were not at all monitored or regulated up until this point. So you could go to like a school for priest formation, or you could be apprenticed under a priest, or you could just sort of kind of end up a priest. Like somebody was like, yep, you're a priest now. There was no regulation. So you ended up with some priests that were incredibly well formed and knew their theology and were devoted to God, practiced the sacraments, lived a sacramental life. And then you had other priests who didn't know any of their theology, didn't do any of their duties. I'm just all over the boards tonight. I apologize. So you had a lot of variation in the quality of formation for a priest. And so, by requiring formation of seminaries, the Council of Trent ensured that all subsequent generations of Catholics would have priests that were actually trained in theology and pastoral duties. And it wouldn't just be like, roll of the dice. Do I have a good priest or do I have a terrible priest? It was going to be a certain set thing where you would indeed have, a priest who is qualified to be a priest, which is fantastic. Seminaries would also serve as filters to get rid of those people who should not be priests. You couldn't have any more state officials who became priests just for power or for status. I think of what Father Daniel has told me about his experience in seminary, what he said before, about having to take multiple different psychological evaluations at different time periods as you go throughout seminary. If you've already been to college, it's a 7-year process. If you haven't yet been to college, it's a 9-year process. What seminaries look like today, it's a very rigorous program to make sure we have well-qualified, educated priests, and ones who also are mentally ready for the trials of being a priest and can handle that. And nobody's there for the wrong reasons. So, this helps immensely in dealing with the problem of bishops appointing their nephew or their cousin who they owe a favor to roles as priests, which is huge in helping the church at this point, because that was a giant problem. After lots of consideration, the council denied the right to marry to the clergy. They reaffirmed celibacy as a vow and an act that contributed to priestly life and holiness. This is something that I think people get confused on sometimes. Priestly celibacy is not natural law. It is canon law. Now, what do I mean by that? Natural law is a moral law inscribed on the human heart. It is God-made. Canon law is a law created by the church for the good of the church to direct oneself to God. So you can think about fasting on Fridays. There used to be a canon law that every single Friday, for every Friday, you were to fast from meat. So you wouldn't have any meat, or you wouldn't have any sweets. Now, canon law has changed, and we only have an obligation to fast on Fridays during Lent. When canon law held every Friday should be a fasting day, it would be a sin if you knowingly decided not to fast. If you knew it was a Friday, you knew canon law said that you should abstain from meat on Friday, and you're like, I'm gonna have a burger anyways, that would be a sin. Canon law has changed since then for a number of reasons, such that only now in Lent are we required to abstain from meat on Fridays. So, this Friday, if I have a burger, there's nothing wrong with that. This comes with the church having the power to bind on earth. What we bind on earth is bound in heaven. What is loosed on earth is loosed in heaven. Canon law does have weight, but it's weight that is given by the church through Christ's authority in the church. So it's not like 100% set in stone that, set in the law of human hearts that priests have to be celibate. This is actually a canon law that the church has for the good of priests, because it helps not only direct them towards God, but it also helps protect them and protect their hearts and helps protect their priestly duties and helps them be better priests. But it is possible that one day in the future, if the church needed it, if something changed such that it no longer was in the priests and the people's best interests for priests to observe a vow of celibacy, it is possible that the church could change this canon law and allow priests to get married. It has happened in the past, or at least priests have gotten married in the past. And then, at a time that was appropriate, the church instituted the rule of celibacy for the good of the priests and for the people. And at the Council of Trent, they affirmed that vow of celibacy. They looked at everything. They said, nope, it is good for priests to not be married and to observe a vow of celibacy. This points them to God. It helps them be better priests and also protects them. So, my point in that tangent? Oh yeah, natural law versus canon law. Canon law still can have moral weight, but also can change. Natural law, natural moral law never changes. Natural moral law would be something like do not kill. Marriage is between a man and a woman. Stealing is bad. Those kinds of things. Canon law, abstain from meat on Fridays. Priests need to obtain a vow of celibacy. Or not obtain, observe a vow of celibacy. All right, so they affirm that vow and that it contributes to priestly life and holiness. That's important because they're saying, no, doing this thing, doing this work, this vow of celibacy, actually edifies, builds up a priest's holiness. It helps them become a holier person. It's not just something we threw in there for kicks. It actually sanctifies them. Protestants lose the notion of sanctification because works have no merit. Thus, priestly celibacy has no merit. That's part of the reason they get rid of it. The church reaffirms, no, it has merit. It helps to sanctify a person. It draws a priest's heart closer to God. It helps him grow in holiness. That was a lot on priestly celibacy, so we're going to move on. So the practical reforms also put in place by the Council of Trent were some of the most profound in Christian history. Its guidelines for reforming the clergy were very clear. They were very thorough. However, the enforcement of these clear guidelines was difficult, and it would take a lot of time to implement them throughout the whole world of Catholicism. I mean, regulation of priests, seminaries, those just don't pop up overnight. Cracking down on priestly celibacy and actually enforcing those stern punishments, that's something that's difficult and it takes time. For the last two classes that we have, we're going to be looking at different aspects of the fourth phase, so how things were implemented after these reforms. Specifically, we're going to look at reforms in the liturgy, in the clergy, so taking a closer look at all of those things. And then our last class is devoted to the Jesuits and education. We only have 2 more. I will end just by saying a bit about Tridentine. So Tridentine, if you've ever heard the word Tridentine Reforms or Tridentine Mass, that means Trent. Why is it Tridentine, which is Tridentine, Tridentine? Why is it Tridentine instead of Trentian? I don't know. It really confused me for a while, but it is. So if you've ever heard of the Tridentine Mass or the Tridentine Reforms, I know I had heard of them before, and then connecting them to the Council of Trent was kind of like an aha moment. This is what we're going to get into next class. Basically, just like how priest education was all over the place and really varied, liturgy was all over the place and could have a lot of variation. Like, there were some parts that were always the same, but there was also a ton of variation. Tridentine reforms, which we get into next class, are all about reforms to the Mass. And with that little preview of next week, I am going to sign off because my little 7-month-old is crying. So thank you guys for watching, and I look forward to talking to you all next week. If you have any questions, you can email me. Yeah, have a great evening.